Coming up on Choppers Politics.
Yes, Boris Johnson's still wearing the halo of the vaccination rollout, but that doesn't last forever. I mean, he isn't literally being inoculated from electoral defeat here.
Labour barely hang on in Batley and Spen.
I do hereby declare that King Michelle Nervita is duly elected.
So, is the Tories' march on the Red Wall over? Is Sir Keir here? Well, for a bit longer anyway. I'm Christopher Hope, the Chief Political Correspondent at the Daily Telegraph, and this is Choppers Politics. And today I'm bringing you a by-election main course with a nice Brexit chaser. ERG Chairman Mark Francois will be joining us later for the very latest on the so-called European Union sausage wars. But first, the Batley and Spen by-election. Who better to pick apart what happened last night, Labour's victory, or was it a hold, than two of my brilliant Telegraph colleagues, Tony Diver, who's been covering this by-election and others this summer, and Camilla Tominey, the Telegraph's Associate Politics Editor. Tony Diver and Camilla Tominey, welcome to Choppers Politics. Great to have you both on.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Tony, you're our by-election correspondent this summer. So to you first, how did Labour win this by-election?
Well, it's pretty astonishing, isn't it, really? We were expecting that the Conservatives were going to take this seat. That's what the bookies told us and what the pollsters told us. It seems like something quite interesting happened yesterday. Well, certainly Labour tell us that what happened was there were Tory voters who switched over to vote Labour, which is not a narrative that we expected to emerge at the back end of this by-election at all. We were thinking that there were Labour voters who were going to vote Tory, a sort of red wall, voters with economic concerns who like Boris Johnson. We were thinking that there were Labour voters who might leave and go and vote for George Galloway, who is the independent candidate there. But Labour tell us that there are plenty of Tories out in the shires, in the villages, who decided that Keir Starmer was the one for them and they vote for Kim Ledbetter. So whether it's because she is a local candidate, she fought her entire campaign basically around the fact that she lives in the constituency, knows lots of people there and cares deeply about local issues, or whether it's because there are people that were put off, for instance, by recent shenanigans of Matt Hancock and not big fans of Boris Johnson. It's quite difficult to tell, but it does seem that that's the thing that's decided it this morning.
Camilla Tominey, what do you make of that then? Tory voters voting Labour. What's going on?
Well, I think it's probably down to a degree of fatigue, perhaps, at the end of what has been a very difficult 18 months, really, for Johnson. Equally, I think the Matt Hancock factor has played a part. I found it astonishing that the Prime Minister earlier in the week at PMQs referred to it as a Westminster bubble story, as if it would actually just burst and disintegrate. And I think it's probably best described as a wrecking ball that could create further havoc for the government, not least in light of their very sluggish response to firing him. I mean, they didn't fire him. In the end, they forced his resignation. But it almost came a day too late when you think about what the public opinion was in the immediate aftermath, which was abject horror and disgust, not necessarily at his infidelity, but the fact he had broken the rules that he had set. So I think Boris Johnson himself has lost a bit of connectivity here and needs to get back to the electorate that he is famed for understanding. I mean, normally he has the finger on the pulse. And we've seen both in Chesham and Amersham last month and now in Batley and Spen. I mean, to miss out by just a few hundred votes when you've got George Galloway splitting the left-wing vote, I think it's really damaging for the Tories.
Camilla Tominey, I'll ask this question of Amanda Milling, the party chairman, when she's on the podcast shortly. But do you think Matt Hancock has saved Keir Starmer's career?
Well, potentially, yes, because I think even if there weren't the Tories switching to Labour on principle, there were also those Tories that just stayed at home out of protest, really. And we also saw that in Chesham and Amersham, which was tied up with a lot of local issues. I think the ghost of Hancock still lingers, and I don't quite know how it can be extinguished. I mean, he's holding on as an MP in a constituency where I believe he has an 18,000 majority. And there's been questions asked in Suffolk as to whether he should stay on there. Clearly, he's now adopted this kind of below radar policy. But I think it's now about Boris Johnson reconnecting with the public. I feel that there's been a disconnect because he hasn't quite understood the public mood on this issue. And there's a sense that he's a bit isolated in Downing Street and out of touch, and maybe even continuing to get the wrong advice. I think there's this sense that Johnson, a man who's always acted on his political instincts, has slightly lost his antennae. I think he needs to get the sort of aerial repairman or woman back in and re-hone and retrain what it is that he is representing. You know, we've lost this massive slogan for the Tories, get Brexit done, and they need to replace it with some sort of clear Conservative vision that voters can latch onto.
Tony Diver in Batley and Spen today, was the fact that Kim Leadbetter was Jo Cox's sister a factor in her narrow victory?
Well, I think that's certainly a part of it, yes. I mean, people in this constituency know who Kim Leadbetter is because she runs the Jo Cox Foundation. That's the charity that was set up in Batley after Jo Cox's death in 2016. And she's a sort of figure of the local community. So a lot of her appeal to voters is that she knows what the local issues are. She meets people on a weekly basis in her job at that charity. So I think her connection to Jo Cox is sort of intrinsically linked to her connection to the town itself. There was a bit of concern on the Labour side that people might, and this is an unfortunate phrase, but it's a phrase that I heard several times from voters, that Labour felt like it might be aiming for a sympathy vote, that people they wanted people to vote for Kim Leadbetter because her sister had been killed. And I don't think that's quite right. And I don't think that was what was borne out this morning in the results. But yeah, certainly I think people who were looking for a local candidate who wanted someone that they recognised probably know Kim because of what happened to Jo.
And Tony, you're there in the constituency now. Where are you now? Where are we speaking to you?
I'm currently sitting outside in Batley, outside a pub, with slightly unreliable Wi-Fi, it must be said.
Waiting for it to open. What was it like covering this by-election? It looked brutal and messy from studying on Twitter and the coverage we saw viewing it from Westminster.
Yeah, some of the campaigning was really nasty, actually. And that's not necessarily from the official campaigners, but from supporters of both Labour and of George Galloway. There was quite a few scenes we've seen on the streets of Batley. We've heard about campaigners being egged. We've heard about people being kicked in the head. There was a video that went up on Twitter that showed Kim Leadbetter being chased down the road by an activist who'd driven up from Birmingham to tell her that she shouldn't support the teaching of LGBT rights in schools. And it feels like because a lot of this campaign has been fought around those identity issues, that it's got very personal and quite nasty. And for Kim Leadbetter, whose sister, as we've said, was killed by a political extremist in 2016, it's a very unfortunate reminder that these things can bubble to the surface all too easily.
Camilla Tominey, do you worry that this could be the pattern for future by-elections as the culture wars rage?
Well, possibly. And I thought it was rich for some people in Labour to sort of start criticising George Galloway, who undoubtedly did use very nasty tactics. But to be fair, Labour activist tactics over the last few years have been quite despicable. You'll hear Tory MPs talk about having rats posted through their letterboxes and all sorts. So look, it has got dirty and it does need to be cleaned up. I don't think it's what anyone in the electorate really wants to see, you know, posters being torn down and all of these sorts of attack issues. What is quite interesting is the fact that some of Galloway's chat on cancel culture and identity politics, and indeed he was banging on about Brexit too, did seem to have some sway with the electorate. I mean, I think that's something that both sides can take note of. You've got on one side Keir Starmer being criticised because he seems to be sort of all things to all lefties and being pulled in different directions by the hard left and the moderate left of his party. And I think Boris Johnson's got to be very careful he doesn't also fall into the trap of seeming not to stand for anything. You know, we had some of this strange progressive banter at the G7 when he started talking about sustainability and binary. I mean, does that really mean anything to the people on the streets of places like Batley and Spen? I doubt it.
I wonder, Camilla, do you think the Tories' charge north was stalled? It was going so well, wasn't it, in Hartlepool? But are we seeing a problem here?
Well, I think Hartlepool was kind of the macro election issues that got the Tories over the line, and this sense that Sir Keir Starmer and Labour currently don't stand for them. I think in Cheshire and Amersham we had the local issues being the issue, and therefore the Lib Dems squeezed in because they campaigned so heavily on the idea of HS2, even though the Lib Dems are in support of it, but it's a very totemic issue in that area. And equally the planning reforms, you know, the Lib Dems basically made out that the Tories were concreting over the countryside. If that's the perception it's not just problematic for people in so-called blue wall areas, but equally those in red wall areas. A lot of those constituencies that the Tories nicked off Labour in 2019 are because they are in rural areas. And people in rural areas don't want to be concreted over whether they're north or south of the M25. So I think that's an issue. Batley and Spen, again, you had this whole issue of the teacher and quite a few kind of religious contortions going on with the Muslim vote. But I think, for a government in the middle of Parliament, having faced this national crisis, yes, Boris Johnson's still wearing the halo of the vaccination rollout, but that doesn't last forever. I mean, he isn't literally being inoculated from electoral defeat here.
And Tony Diver, what does Keir Starmer do now? For my hapeth would be he needs a big fight with the left at the party conference this year to show to Middle England he is changing the party and making it electable. What do you think?
Well, I think there's people on the right of the Labour Party who'd agree with you, Chris. And certainly Peter Mandelson this morning came out and said that there needs to be this showdown at party conference this summer where Starmer says to the left, right, I've won in Batley and Spen. I am not as weak as you say I am. And the Labour left have been carping on at Keir for months now. Now you need to listen to me and we're going to do it my way. But I mean, that view is obviously, as you would expect, not shared across the Labour Party. And some Labour MPs that I've spoken to this morning say actually the win in Batley and Spen was incredibly narrow. It's Kim Leadbeater won by 323 votes. That's her majority. That's 10% of the majority that Tracy Brabin held before her. And it was a marginal seat before that anyway. So there are plenty of people on the left who say this is not quite the ringing endorsement of his leadership that Keir Starmer thinks it is. And what he needs to do now is unite the party, they say. And when the Labour left say unite the party, what they mean is get a load of those Corbynites that have been shoved out of the shadow cabinet and put them back. And so what we are heading for, I think, is a pretty big reckoning between those two sides of the party, which may well come at party conference. And if Keir Starmer agrees with Peter Mandelson that now is the time to expunge all of the remaining critics that he has in the Labour Party, then I think we could see it get pretty feisty this year.
Expect some fireworks. And just finally then, Camilla, Tominey and Tony Diver, we've had 3 by-elections this summer. The Tories won Hartlepool, Lib Dems won Cheshire and Amersham, and now Labour have won Batley and Spen. All were surprising for different reasons. What are your takeaways from this? To you first, Camilla.
Well, I think actually they all had their unique set of circumstances. And maybe when you look at it in the round, it's not so bad for the government when you consider that they have been in power now for more than a decade. And equally, they've just come through a national emergency. But I think looking forward, you've got the same issue facing both sides. And that is that they need to nail their colours to the mast. What kind of Labour Party is Sir Keir Starmer going to lead? And equally, now he's got Brexit done. What is Boris Johnson's ideological vision for Britain outside of the EU? And how is he going to take this country forward?
And finally, Tony Diver.
Yeah, I think I would say that maybe one of the things that we've learned from all 3 of these by-elections is that the old political alignments and the safe seats and the strongholds are not quite what we thought they were, and that we got a hint of that in 2019 when all of these red wall seats fell to the Tories. But what we learnt in Hartlepool is that that's still going on. What we learnt in Cheshire and Amersham is that the Tories are not as safe in the southeast as they thought they were. And what we've just learnt in Batley and Spen is that there are sort of other political forces and political divisions that can very easily, if not unseat you, almost unseat you. So I think as all the parties head towards the next election, whether it's in 2023 or 2024, they'll be quite mindful that all of those old cliches and tropes about where the parties have their support look like they don't hold quite so strongly anymore.
Fascinating stuff. Well, Tony Diver in Batley and Spen, Camilla Tominey, I think, at home.
In Hertfordshire, yes.
In Hertfordshire. Thank you for joining us today for a review of last night's drama in Batley and Spen. Thanks for joining us. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And if you want to hear more brilliant expert analysis from Tony Diver or Camilla Tominey, and you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, please go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper to get your first month subscription completely free of charge. Sticking with Batley and Spen. Now, when we booked our next guest to appear on this week's show, she probably thought she might be celebrating a Conservative by-election victory. But instead, Amanda Milling, the co-chairman of the party, has been doing the rounds of the broadcast studios, having to explain what went wrong. Hi Amanda, how are you?
A bit tired, if I'm being honest. I was sleep deprived, Chris.
I know. But despite Amanda's long night, she has agreed to appear on this week's Chopper's Politics. And I started by asking her why the Tories had failed to win this by-election.
I think I want to reframe that slightly. It's not that we
come on.
lost it. We didn't gain it. Look, this was always going to be a really tough battle for us. And obviously, I'm incredibly disappointed by the result. I want to pay tribute to Ryan Stevenson, who worked so hard on the campaign, day in, day out, knocking on doors. Also congratulate Kim. But this was always going to be a tough battle for us. You know, if you think about it, we're 11 years into government. Governing parties don't win by-elections. They don't win by-elections, let alone gain by-elections. And actually, if you look at the result, we were just so close to actually gaining that seat off Labour. It's very much a Labour hold rather than a big Labour win.
You really were close, 323 votes in it, really tight. Do you think the failure of Boris Johnson to sack Matt Hancock for 24 hours last Friday cost you those votes?
Look, there were a whole range of issues that came up on the doorstep in terms of why we didn't get over the line. But I'll be honest, it did come up on the doorstep at the weekend. But, you know, as I say, it was one of a number of different things that people were talking about. And actually for us, what we were doing was trying to make a positive case as to why people should elect a Conservative MP for Batley and Spen, focusing relentlessly on the local issues that really matter to people.
Do you think Matt Hancock has saved Keir Starmer's career?
As I say, I don't personally think that this was a big win for Labour. They should have been holding this seat with a much bigger majority. So I think there's still a lot of questions for the Labour Party and Sir Keir to answer. And actually, one of the things I would observe about the campaign is the fact that they weren't using Labour branding. It was dialed down on their literature. You know, you could barely tell it was a Labour poster. It was not even red. Labour logo was really small. And let's be honest as well, we didn't really see very much of Sir Keir on the campaign. So the question is, why were they kind of really distancing themselves from Labour and also from the leader?
And just finally, Matt Hancock, is that matter closed? Is there an investigation into him in any sense? Is there a concern from the local party in Suffolk he might be deselected?
Last weekend, Matt did the right thing by resigning. He apologised and he lost his job over this.
Just on Labour then and how they fought the Batley and Spen by-election, were they more vocal on the issue of the reprimanded teacher, do you think? This teacher who showed a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad in a lesson about blasphemy?
No, I don't think that they were actually kind of more vocal on this issue. You know, Ryan was very clear in terms of his views on this issue. You know, the idea that the teacher could, in theory, go back to school, but it feels that he can't go back to school is an appalling situation to find ourselves in. And actually, that Labour were pretty quiet in terms of what their views were and not very clear.
Were you too reliant, you think, on Labour votes being eaten away by votes going to George Galloway? 8,000 votes went to him. Do you think that you sat back too much and let that happen and weren't fighting the votes hard enough? Was Ryan doing the work he needed to win?
He worked his absolute socks off. We all worked our socks off. It was brilliant to see so many volunteers from across the country come up to Batley and Spen to support Ryan. He was there day in, day out, knocking on doors, kind of reaching out to voters, explaining what he would do for Batley and Spen. I know that I spent an awful lot of the last few weeks up there as well, campaigning, supporting. We ran a relentless campaign and a positive campaign.
You've been out there, as you say, campaigning in Batley and Spen. You've been knocking on doors, talking to people. Is there a frustration, do you think, that the restrictions haven't been lifting quick enough?
So actually, what I was picking up on the doorstep was a desire for change. You know, they wanted to have a new MP who would stand up for them. One of the things that came up was the fact that Tracy Brabin had basically ditched them as constituents as part of her political career. Let's be honest, the only reason we've had this by-election is by virtue of her trying to kind of move on to something else. And this was completely unnecessary.
So you don't think there's any frustration with all these socially distancing measures we have to put up with at the moment? That didn't lead to a reversal on the doorstep for you?
No, that wasn't one of the issues that were coming up. And actually, I think the public understands that, you know, we've come a long way. The vaccine's been rolled out. You know, that it has been frustrating. Everyone's made huge sacrifices. But as the Prime Minister said, we need to make sure that this is cautious and irreversible, because what we don't want to find ourselves is back in this situation. So got a few weeks to go to get these vaccines rolled out so that we can get back to life as normal.
A big issue we're pushing on the Telegraph is this one about the issue of school bubbles.
So I know this is something that the Education Secretary was talking about earlier in the week, that we don't want children to be missing out on those all-important days in school. So we are looking at how do we ensure that we manage to keep children as far as possible in school and not huge bubbles of children.
But why don't move faster on that? Why don't get those bubbles ended as soon as possible so we can try and get these kids back to school despite this virus?
As I say, the Education Secretary set out that, he wants us to get this situation sorted as quickly as possible as well. And as with all of this, everything's constantly under review. We're still tackling this virus. There are so many different elements to it. What we need to make sure is that we get this vaccine rolled out, we get adults vaccinated so that we can open up the country, and we can also make sure that kids are in school.
Where do you sit on the issue of bubbles? Are you keen for them to be lifted as quickly as possible?
So from my point of view, I just don't want to see children unnecessarily missing out on days in school. It's so important to their future prospects, being in school, having that time in school with their teachers and also with their peers as well. So let's get them back in school, being educated as quickly as possible. Every single by-election is unique. Let's look, we've had 3 over the last, 6 weeks. I'm sure that we're a bit by-electioned out, actually. But each one's unique. And it goes back to that point that actually as a governing party, the fact that we're even on the pitch is quite extraordinary. This was a particularly challenging seat for us. We didn't win it in 2019. Yet we were even, there was lots of people talking about the prospect of us winning. The fact that we came so close in itself is extraordinary. And there were so many factors at play. It was at the same time as the mayoral election where Ben had such a resounding win. But, obviously, as I say, each and every one is very different.
When will the Tories commit to the North? We read, didn't we, a year or so ago, you're going to move your headquarters to Leeds. That hasn't happened yet. Why not? Why is CCHQ still based down in London?
We'll have some news on that imminently. We're fully committed to basing ourselves, having our second headquarters in Leeds, and we'll have more information very soon.
It's just you and me talking, Amanda. Come on, tell us now.
I'm afraid you're not going to get an exclusive this morning, but all I would say is we're fully committed to opening that office.
What lesson do you take from these past 3 victories won by the Tories, the Lib Dems and Labour? It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're trying to divine a pattern here, and it's quite hard to see one. I suppose Labour should be doing better at this stage, 11 years into a Tory government. They're not doing, but the Lib Dems are biting at your heels in the south, and that must be a concern.
Labour should be doing much, much better. If you look at their result in Hartlepool, they lost Hartlepool. They didn't even keep their deposit in Chesham and Amersham. At this point in time, they should be gaining seats from us in quite a big way. It shouldn't be the fact that we're having a conversation about us possibly taking seats off them. In terms of Chesham and Amersham, it was another completely unique election. The Liberal Democrats literally threw everything at it. I think Peter put the kitchen sink, the cooker, the cat, the dog was literally thrown at that. And actually, there was an awful lot of scaremongering in that particular campaign. But I think the one key learning you take from this is each of these different by-elections is totally, totally different. So it's very difficult to kind of come to some key conclusions when there are 3 different by-elections.
Amanda Milling, thank you for joining me on today's Choppers Politics. I know you're tired, you've been up all night, and we do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, while Amanda goes off for a well-earned rest, stay tuned, because next up we have Mark Francois, the chairman of the ERG, with an interesting view about why Brexiteers need to thank Angela Merkel. Right after this.
I'm Sophia Yan, the Telegraph's China correspondent. And in our latest documentary podcast, I take you inside a story of uprising, of dark twists and turns, and of a people's fight for freedom.
I forewarn those radicals not to attempt to violate this law because the consequences are very serious.
You never know who will report you, who will denounce you.
Such a beautiful and wonderful city being dismantled by this terrible regime. just for their obsession on power, total control.
Our new series tells you how one law turned Hong Kong upside down. Over 4 episodes, you'll hear from the activists and politicians who fled their own country, the young people finding their own quiet ways to keep resisting, and the parents worried for their children's future. It's a tale that tells us as much about China as it does Hong Kong. Search Hong Kong Silenced wherever you're listening to this.
And we're back. Now here on Chopper's Politics, we haven't forgotten our roots. Don't forget, we started out as Chopper's Brexit podcast. And so despite the excitement of a by-election, it would be rude not to bring you the latest Brexit developments. And this week, a 3-month truce was agreed on what's been dubbed the Sausage Wars. This new arrangement means that a meat ban due to come into force as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol will instead be postponed until the end of September. Now, Brussels claims it's turned its rules and regulations upside down to make this protocol work. But how quickly will this particular Brexit battle resume? This is, after all, just putting the argument on pause for a few more months. Well, one man with a lot to say on all things Brexit is, of course, ERG chairman Mark Francois. Mark Francois, chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs, welcome back to Chopper's Politics.
It's great to be back, Chopper. Thank you for having me.
Was renamed, of course, when you were last on it a few times, Chopper's Brexit Podcast. Now it's called Chopper's Politics because Brexit is done, isn't it? It's all finished with.
Well, we have left the European Union. We have left the transition period. We are an independent sovereign nation, which is what the people of this country voted for democratically and peacefully just over 5 years ago. So we've got Brexit done. But
Mark, Northern Ireland is still a big issue. I mean, we've got this 3-month extension here from the European Union and the UK, but isn't that just kicking the can down the road with some added sprinkles, i.e. nothing actually has changed apart from a few deals around the edges on guide dogs, very important as they are, and other areas?
When you look at the way the EU and the European Commission in particular behaves on this, you have to put it in a wider context. For many on the continent, they believe in creating a federal European state. They call that the project. And the officials in the European Commission are, if you like, the high priests of this project. For them, it's almost akin to a religion. And everything that they do has to be seen in terms of defending and promoting the project. What's that got to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol? Well, the EU is becoming unpopular among many of its citizens, not least because of the very slow rollout of the vaccines. And so many in the Commission are determined to make Northern Ireland's position as difficult as possible. Pour en courage les autres, in case anyone in Warsaw or Rome ever gets any bright ideas about leaving the EU as well. So that is why they're being so completely anally retentive about the interpretation of the protocol. This is completely deliberate. And when, on the 29th of January, the Commission exercised Article 16, which is like the emergency clause within the protocol, they did that in effect to create a hard border on the island of Ireland over vaccines, having all the way through what I call the battle for Brexit faithfully promised that they were utterly determined to avoid any such thing. When it suited their purposes, they tried to do it anyway. They didn't really care much about the people of Northern Ireland, nor did they care very much about the people of the Irish Republic. The strong rumour is they never even told Dublin they were going to do it. So not only did they throw the Irish under a bus, as the saying has it, they then whacked the bus into reverse and drove back over them again for good measure. That shows you how much the European Commission care about people on the island of Ireland.
But Mark, all that's in the past, surely. The European Union have said sorry. They did apologise for the 3 hours when they invoked the Article 16. They have said sorry for that, and they're trying to move on. But don't you think that we're now stuck in this never-ending circle of can kicking? Because what Northern Ireland doesn't want, and because it can't really work, is any kind of certainty about border issues.
Well, they may have said sorry, but I think it's an insincere apology. And, to use a colloquial phrase, when they invoked Article 16, as it were, they gave themselves away. And what they were doing was trying to defend the project. They tried to recreate or to create a hard border on the island of Ireland, having spent 3 years swearing blind that everything they were doing was to avoid exactly that same thing. So when we see the way that they are trying to interpret the protocol in this extremely strict way, we have to understand why they're doing it, and they're doing it to make life difficult in order to persuade no one else to try to attempt to leave. Remember, everyone says they want to protect the Good Friday Agreement. I think hopefully people do. The heart of the Good Friday Agreement is the principle of consent. Well, he's absolutely as plain as a pikestaff that the Unionist community in Northern Ireland do not consent to the way the Northern Ireland Protocol is being interpreted by the European Commission. So they are undermining the Good Friday Agreement by their intransigent stance.
There's been recent talk, hasn't there, from leaders in Ireland about uniting Ireland in the lifetime of some people there. Do you think this chaos is being used by Ireland, encouraged by Ireland to try and unite Ireland?
There may be an element of that. I mean, I think there was a recent poll by the Northern Ireland Life and Times Survey organisation a few months ago that actually said only 30% of people in Northern Ireland wanted to see a united Ireland. It was 53% were against it, 30% were pro, and I think from memory most of the others were don't know or undecided. So there doesn't at the moment appear to be a really overwhelming groundswell of support either for a border poll or for uniting with the South. But the Commission's main objective, as I'm saying, is to be as hardline as they can on the protocol in order to prevent any other European nations or dissuade them from ever thinking of abandoning the project.
Do you think this suits the agendas of some people in government? There's suggestions Michael Gove may want a softer Brexit deal. There's advisors around Michael Gove who are now quite close to Boris Johnson. Is Lord Frost doing the work? I mean, a negotiation is two sides and maybe he isn't quite landing his punches properly. Who do you blame?
Well, I'm a great fan of Lord Frost, and I think he well understands that the protocol is not sustainable in the long term. I mean, in the short term, we need easements of the type that you mentioned earlier. But in the long term, I believe that the protocol is unsustainable. And the ERG produced a report in February on exactly this issue. It was entitled Reuniting the Kingdom, How and Why to Replace the Northern Ireland Protocol. So that's fairly clear. And I think over the long term, we're going to have to replace it with something. And I believe that Lord Frost completely understands that. And I also believe he's a brilliant negotiator who is not frightened to look the EU in the eye and defend the United Kingdom's national interest.
But he's not, is he, Mark Francois? He's not doing that. He's allowed the can to be kicked down the road. OK, it's been dealt with to avoid any trouble as the peak of the marching season starts in Northern Ireland. But he's not doing it. He's not flexing the muscles that we now have as an independent nation against the European Union, is he?
Well, look, on the trade and cooperation agreement, everybody said that we wouldn't get that. We did. And, Lord Frost was the negotiator that delivered that. So also remember the Northern Ireland Protocol replaced the dreaded backstop. That is the reason why, in the end, the ERG voted for it, so that we could actually leave the European Union, although we made very plain at the time in private to Number 10 and others that we regarded that as unfinished business and that eventually the Northern Ireland Protocol itself would have to be changed. But we voted for it at the time because it was the only way practically of leaving the European Union. Now, remember, after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, the EU's line was they would never, ever reopen the original withdrawal agreement, Theresa May's version. And even if they did, there was no way on earth that they would ditch the backstop. In the end, they did both in 3 months when we stood up to them. So using that as an empirical example, if we are prepared to be robust, then I believe that we can eventually get them to abandon the Northern Ireland Protocol. But that will not happen overnight. And I'm absolutely convinced Lord Frost is the man to do it.
Mark Francois, you can see round corners. You did so over Brexit. You got Brexit right. You called it right. You opposed the Theresa May deal. You won. When will the Northern Ireland Protocol be abandoned? Give me a date.
Chopper, I'm good, but I'm not that good. But I do believe that eventually it will go. And I'm encouraged by Jeffrey Donaldson becoming the leader of the DUP. I think that's a very important development in this context. I'm not going to dwell on the internal problems of the DUP, but I personally think that they've made the right decision in appointing Jeffrey Donaldson as their leader, not least because he's quite good at seeing ahead as well, in my experience. I've known the man for 20 years. So I think that's a positive development. I think over time it will become more and more apparent that the protocol is unsustainable and that will lead to change.
That's years, not months away by your reckoning.
No, I don't think we're talking years and years. And again, I use the empirical example of what happened over the original backstop. And it was Frost that achieved that, obviously working for Boris as Prime Minister.
Now, today in the UK, we're saying goodbye to Angela Merkel. She meets the Queen. She goes to Chequers. She attends a cabinet. She gets the full Whitehall red carpet. Is that right? Do you think it was Angela Merkel who lost Britain for the European Union by not being more flexible on the deal that David Cameron wanted back in 2016?
In which case, we must treat her very nicely and, make a real fuss of her. No, I mean, look, whatever view anyone takes on Brexit, whether you will remain or leave, Angela Merkel undoubtedly was a giant of European politics for a decade and a half. I think that's unarguable. She's coming to the end of a very long post as Chancellor of Germany. And, I think we have to acknowledge her long service. And I hope we treat her, really nicely as she comes to the end of that part of her career. And whether or not we bring up the football is a matter for the Prime Minister.
And before we move on, you've written a book, a memoir. I know this. I've seen reports about it. This is an attempt at trying to get the history of Brexit being written by someone who won the fight, because most of the history so far have been written by what you might describe as Remainers in old money. Well,
it's called Spartan Victory. And it's about the role that the ERG and in particular the 28 so-called Spartans played in opposing Theresa May's flawed withdrawal agreement right through to the end, most famously on Meaningful Vote 3 on the 29th of March 2019. And yes, if you like, it's an attempt to give our side of the story. Most of the books that have been written on this have been written from a Remainer perspective, and I think it's only right that someone writes one from a Leave perspective, and then, having put that on the record, we can leave it to the historians to judge.
And when's the book out?
Later in the autumn. And Chopper, you will get a personally signed first edition.
Now, just changing tack briefly, Mark Francois, you're also the deputy chairman of the Northern Ireland Veteran Support Group in the House of Commons. And your big concern, and many people's concern, is about veterans being pursued through the courts for issues related to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And you're worried now about a backtrack from the government. Is that right?
Yes, well, Ian Duncan-Smith, who served in Northern Ireland, which of course I never did, is our chairman. I'm his deputy. And there are a group of colleagues who've come together because we're concerned about this endless cycle of investigation and reinvestigation of Northern Ireland veterans. Now, the government have been promising to do something about this for 4 years. It was in our 2017 manifesto, our 2019 manifesto. The Prime Minister's on the record multiple times of saying we were going to legislate. So are many other senior ministers. And yet still, we don't have a bill. And the problem here is that it's the Northern Ireland office who are on the lead here, not the Ministry of Defence. The MOD recently produced a bill looking at regarding Afghan and Iraq veterans, the Overseas Operations Bill. It's the NIO, and it's an open secret in Westminster that the NIO are foot dragging because as an organisation, they clearly don't want to do this. The culture of the Northern Ireland office is they've never been too worried about what happens to Corporal Tommy Atkins. They're much more worried about appeasing Sinn Féin to keep them in the Northern Ireland executive at almost any cost. An example, 2 years ago, a civil servant in the Northern Ireland office was paid £10,000 of British taxpayers' money because he was offended by having to walk past a portrait of Her Majesty the Queen when he went to his desk each morning in the NIO. We paid him that money. That little vignette tells you everything you need to know about the Northern Ireland office. And many of us are now absolutely sick and tired of the endless foot dragging by the NIO, and I have to say by the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis, who keeps promising us in private that we're just about to get a bill, but we never quite do. So he's becoming rather like the boy who cried wolf. If you remember from the fable, after a while, no one believed anything the boy said anymore.
Well, Mark Francois, Brandon Lewis would defend his case and would probably say that he's trying to get this legislation published as soon as possible and would defend his own honour. But you are concerned about it. And what you're hoping for is some kind of legislation later this year now, aren't you? That's the best hope you've got.
Well, Brandon has been telling us in private that we would have the second reading of a bill by the summer recess, which is now barely 3 weeks ago. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, told the Defence Committee last week that I serve on that would not happen until the autumn. So we've now got two different cabinet ministers saying two very different things. Look, we've had 4 years to do this. Everyone knows the NIO don't want to do it, but the government and the Prime Minister have promised that we're going to do it. So we need a Northern Ireland Secretary who's going to drive this through and keep the government honest. We need to lift the sword of Damocles from above the head of these men, many of whom are in the autumn of their lives, unfortunately, a number of whom are in very poor health. At some point, you have to stop talking and actually get on with it. And what I'm saying is, when it comes to the NIO, a number of us we're sort of timed out on this. We have lost patience with the endless prevarication and delay. These people defended us. We now need to defend them. And when's the NIO going to get on with it?
Well, Mark Francois, we'll go to the NIO and try and get them back onto this show in coming weeks to ask them that very question. Thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you, Mark. Now, we should say that after Mark spoke to us, we did get in touch with sources close to Brandon Lewis to respond to the comments made by Mark in that interview. And they said the following. Now, Brandon Lewis has made more progress on legacy issues than the government ever has before. It's vital we get this right and deliver the outcomes we all want to see for victims and veterans alike. It's been 23 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. If there was a straightforward solution, then it would have been done by now. Our intention remains to bring something forward before the summer recess. Well, there we go. Some interesting discussions this week. I'd love to hear what you think. Please let me know. Email me, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or find us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. Thanks to my guests, the Telegraph's very own Tony Diver and Camilla Tominey, of course. Tory party co-chairman Amanda Milling, and Tory MP and chairman of the ERG, Mark Francois. Thanks to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Loulidis. But most importantly of all, as ever, thank you to you for listening. If you enjoyed this show, please do give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this podcast. And finally, if you can, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, though, cheerio!